Well, of course, that directly leads into the subject matter of your book, the relation between God's initiative, God's gift of grace, and the problem of human freedom.
Yes.
The fact that we can choose, and it is often difficult to choose. Often difficult to choose the right thing to do.
That's right.
And could you tell us something about what your book is about?
When I was in graduate school, I was fascinated by some of what Lonergan had written about the doctrine of grace. As a young Jesuit, he had followed his own course of doctoral studies, and for his dissertation, he wrote about Thomas Aquinas on the issue of grace.
Right.
He was trying to figure out what it was that Aquinas had understood when he understood something about grace.
Sure.
I was particularly interested in what Lonergan had to say about the distinction between what's natural and what's supernatural. Now, the term supernatural is a very difficult one for us to use today because it's been it no longer has its original meaning
It has
that
some...
it had in systematic theology. But I was fascinated by what he had to say about that, about grace, which in the strict theological sense is supernatural,
Right.
and the difference it makes in individual human beings and in human society.
Right.
So what I ended up doing was going back to some of Lonergan's original writing on grace, not only what he did when he did his historical study of Aquinas, but also something that he wrote when he was teaching after he completed his doctoral studies. He took what he had learned from Aquinas by his historical study and sort of reorganized it. He had learned a lot about grace from Aquinas. And so instead of presenting it in that historical way, he sat down and said, now if you were going to write a treatise about the doctrine of grace, where would you start and how would you lay it all out?
Right.
Well, he did that in a very sketchy form in some notes for his students, about 80 pages of single-spaced Latin typescript. A little work called De Ente Supernaturali, on supernatural being. So I kind of used those two things, his dissertation on Aquinas and then his more systematic work, and just tried to spell out in detail what he had accomplished in doing those things, because it's difficult for us to appreciate it for two reasons. One is that the work itself is difficult. In other words, he's dealing with ideas that are hard to come by, ideas that you have to kind of work at in order to understand.
Sure.
But the other reason is that an awful lot of what he had to say about grace was couched in the language of neo-scholasticism, or of Aquinas' brand of philosophy and theology. And we're no longer familiar with that. If you go, like I did, and study theology, even on the doctoral level, you have to work hard to learn that stuff, to find someone who will teach it to you, because that's not that's just not the brand.
It's not our world today. It's
No,
not
it's
our
not.
world today.
So essentially what I had to do was to figure out what Lonergan had figured out, to try to explain it so people could understand it, not only in terms of communicating difficult ideas, but also trying to show them what his way of talking about it means now if you translate it into an idiom that we're more familiar with.
I suspect the transposition into terms that are more meaningful for us today was an especially difficult task.
Yeah, it was, because I had to go back and learn that whole old way of expression. So I had to read lots of articles and books and come across terms that I didn't understand and try to make sense out of them by reading first this author and then another author, and finally, you know, one by one the lights went on, and I was kind of able to familiarize myself with that older context of doing theology.
Right. Now, how did Lonergan himself, in his method, achieve this transposition?
Well, what Lonergan was really interested in was the way human beings work.
Right.
Human nature. what is it that makes us tick? And it turns out that in the real world, the world that actually exists, we're not just operating according to human nature, but we're always being offered grace as well. And very often, grace is playing a role in the way we think,
Sure.
In the choices that occur to us,
Right.
the options that occur to us in a choice, and even in our actual ability to make particular decisions.
Right.
And that's true not only of us as individuals, but it's true of us in our interactions in groups and communities of various kinds. So what Lonergan was really interested in was ultimately trying to find ways of talking concretely about how grace makes a difference
Right.
in the way we live.
Right.
In addition, because grace is something that affects the way we think and the way we feel and the way we choose, it has a conscious component. It affects our consciousness,
Right.
which means that even though we can't say whether or not we have been saved and so on, that's something that as Catholics we wouldn't hold.
Sure.
Nonetheless, Lonergan and a number of other theologians before and since, Lonergan was convinced that we can notice the experience of grace, that when grace is affecting us, at times at least, we can be cognizant of that.
Right.
We can cooperate with it more effectively if we're aware that it's
Well, this
there
is
being
it.
offered to
Yes.
us.